and thank you for having this conference here on my great teacher, Ferdinand Ulrich. He's also for me a kind of spiritual father, which I will explain soon. But I'm very, very astonished and excited that you managed to translate Homo Abyssus, David. Over years, it's if you try to read Heidegger in German, Ulrich is worse, So, and even I think as original as Heidegger in his own language, and usually I couldn't imagine how to translate this in English. So you've done a wonderful job, and I'm happy to start this edition with this conference. And thank you for inviting me. In this opening address, I would like to introduce you to the person and work of Ferdinand Ulrich, who greets you all. I phoned to him last week, only he's still alive, and I'll show you a picture at the end of this paper. But he's not the person who would go to conferences anymore, so he's very much in retreat, and he's praying a lot. Basically, his whole day is praying for the church. And the German church is much in need for prayer, so you're cordially invited to pray for the church in Germany. Ferdinand Ulrich does it all the time, and also for me and some of you as well, and I'm certain for this conference, who he knows is running now. So I have studied this work and had the privilege to know him personally for a long time. I think he's, as this was remarked, a great philosopher. And I will show you also clearly later that he is also a teacher of prayer and in general a remarkable teacher. I would like to take this opportunity to elucidate why Ulrich is both a profound teacher and a spiritual father, and will speak of his work within this broader framework. I will first indicate Ulrich's vision of an authentic teacher, and then say a word on what it has meant for Ulrich himself to be a teacher of philosophy. I will then mention a fundamental aspect of his philosophical reflection. He thinks within the church in a way that neither absorbs philosophy into theology nor the latter in the former. Rather, his method is immensely fruitful for both disciplines. Finally, I will conclude with a few remarks on a very important aspect of his and also my life, and thought that can easily pass unnoticed. Ferdinand Ulrich is a great teacher of prayer and, as I mentioned, a spiritual father. We discover Ulrich's understanding of the nature of teaching and the role of the teacher articulated in one of his early texts, an essay published in 1965 entitled Philosophical Reflections on the Question, What is Pedagogy? His vision of the teacher is one that is deeply rooted in the tradition that passes from Augustine, who presents the original teacher, Christ, as more or less the only teacher who deserves this name. And he goes on to study the role of the teacher in Aquinas, who sees the teacher more externally, eliciting and reinforcing the student's own nature and natural capacity to learn, whereas Augustine focuses on the direct illumination through Christ within his life and his thought and capacity to know. But Ulrich also stands entirely within a modern philosophical context, which becomes apparent in the way in which the historicity of human existence, the dialogical dimension, and the freedom of teacher and learner are made thematically explicit in his line of inquiry of this subject. Ulrich begins by clarifying that scientific objectivity cannot mean that the knowing subject would have to be set over against the object of knowledge and separate from it, ostensibly in order to safeguard the objectivity of that knowledge. Conversely, however, it is also the case that the subjectivity of the knower does not have an absolute say in what is true, which would trivialize the significance of the object and leave everything up to the subject. An idea that we have in modern philosophy, more or less dominant. From the beginning, the principal issue for Ulrich is the proper relationship between the reflexive subject and the reflected object, between the subject's positing and his presupposing of the object as given. Quote, bit complicated quote, but worth quoting it. Reflection on knowledge is unveiled in knowing, as demanded by the unity of positing and presupposing, the self-presentation of the world and the creative calling forth of the world. For knowledge is always both my knowing and a knowing of something. These two aspects retain their unity throughout the subject's differentiation from the object, unquote. According to Ulrich, knowledge in the proper sense of the term is therefore also co-characterized and co-determined by an affirmative act of will on the side of the knower, through which the knower affirms at the same time both himself and the object he seeks to understand. So knowing implies an affirmative act of the knower, in which he affirms himself and the object he seeks to understand. Quote, through this act of affirmative resolve, the entire configuration of man's historical reality passes, even if only implicitly, into the objectively displayed form of knowledge. In this sense, one can say that precisely where knowledge occurs in a purely theoretical mode, the ethos of responsibility and the personal element also come to expression as the index of historically existing freedom. But if the knower affirms himself in the process of turning toward his object, and if in doing so he carries out what Thomas calls a reditio in se ipsum, that is, a return into his own essence, then it becomes clear that he never enacts himself in this operation as an isolated subject, but he always already finds himself involved within a sphere of interpersonal exchange. The object approaches him from out of the space of truth, which, however, is always already the space of truth for others. Some object you are confronted with is always already presented within a certain context of people knowing it, talking about it, presenting it in some way. Here, Ulrich makes clear that the dimension of the thou does not enter into the event of the object's disclosure within the knower's intellectual self-enactment as a super-added element, but the thou is in a certain sense already presupposed. As a dialogical being, man has always, from the very beginning, arrived at himself from the other. And in his operations, he always and abidingly returns back to himself from within the experience of the other, which is why the thou also never ceases to approach him anew, to come toward him as also as an abiding future. So the thou is not always only a kind of Vergangenheit, past, sorry, but also always anew a future. But if he has always already received himself from the other, then through the other and along with him, he also has received the world. Ulrich is therefore able to say that the horizon of the thou as a horizon of the other's freedom, which opens up to the knower, is not at bottom a secondary and derivative experience. Instead, the reverse is true, more originally. The knowing experience of the otherness of the object in the unity of positing and presupposing is itself a derivative experience founded on the more original I-thou relationship, on the basis of which man has always already received himself and his world from the other. And this original experience of the unity of the affirmative, positing and presupposing of the other thou, and the having been posited and presupposed by the thou, is in a certain respect the proper measure or criterion of an intellectual interaction with objects. Why is that? Because in the original experience, the otherness is presupposed and affirmed not simply in an objective way, but more profoundly and comprehensively as personal freedom. Quote, "For this reason we can say that one has probably carried out the operation of knowing only insofar as the act enters into this crisis of self-communication, which is not something added to the act as an extrinsic element, but has instead always already been presupposed in the act itself. This implies, however, that the knower's act of knowing is always taken up anew into the space of self-communication, because it also at bottom proceeds from this sphere. Here we discover the root of the original unity between research and teaching. Now, the act of teaching is probably unveiled from out of this original belonging together of the teacher and the object in what Ulrich calls the We-Space, der Wir-Raum in German, We-Space of personal freedom, I, thou, we, in which the concrete thou, as the other that faces me now explicitly, steps forth as student. At this point, Ulrich both accompanies Thomas and goes beyond him at the same time. The student is not only presupposed as a natural being with a specific capacity for knowledge, who, in analogy to health and the doctor, presents himself as one to be treated in an external sense. Instead, the true teacher not only presupposes the nature of the student and his or her native intellectual capacities, but also presupposes the student as concrete, historical, unique, and personal freedom. In other words, the genuine teacher presupposes the student as a thou, and for that very reason as personal self-relation. Self-relation in the sense understood that he or she is an I who am given to myself. I am a self-relation. Every one of us is one. This opening up toward the thou at the same time enables the teacher not only to direct the students in a merely external sense, so that the student can at the same time go on to find his way into the movement of knowing on his own in an interior, which is to say natural sense. Instead, according to Ulrich, the good teacher is also the one who affirms the student not simply in accordance with his nature, but also as a whole person. And the teacher does this by communicating himself along with the content that he is teaching, but in such a way that, on the one hand, the teacher disappears behind the matter he is presenting. In other words, he becomes transparent in his self-expression, so that the matter itself is able to shine forth of its own accord. And on the other hand, he also communicates himself to the student in such a way that in the act of teaching, he directs himself in what he teaches entirely to the particular student. Indeed, he does so in such a way that he not only allows the matter itself to shine forth in itself, but he also transforms the thing that he knows, the matter that he explains, into a gift that is communicated to the student. The true teacher gives this gift to the recipient in a manner that elicits the student's own involvement, in a manner that enables and empowers the student at the same time to enter into his own ability to understand. In other words, the teacher, as one who freely gives, does not only give something, but through his engagement, he at the same time gives himself, and he thus, in his giving, reinforces and brings to perfection the act of receiving. The teacher, as Ulrich understands him, does not simply remain an external and thus in scholastic terms an artificial support of the student's own capacity to learn, but he enters so fully into the place of the other, into his interior space, that he is able to awaken this other into his own ability to understand. A paradigm for this can be seen in the mother who teaches her child to speak. The mother carries on conversations with her child even before the child is able to say a single word. But she speaks in a way that fits the child. As she speaks to him, at the very same time, she listens to her child and listens along with her child in his ability to understand. She speaks in a childlike way, which is to say that she enters so fully and interiorly into the place of the child that she awakens from within him, and not only externally, his own capacity to enter into speech. To be sure, we have to emphasize explicitly that she co-awakens the child. In other words, she awakens something that is already there, namely the capacity simply to be spoken to, whether it be the mother or some older thou, so that the child may find himself able to give a response. This means the giving of the communicated matter to the receiver is enacted simultaneously as a hearing. It is at the same time a receiving of the listener, who indeed already in his always historical ability to listen is already expressing himself, precisely as one who is able to understand the matter in just this way at just this moment in history. You realize how much the dialogical, the historical dimension and the dimension of freedom enters into this thought. The goal of all communication, all teaching is thus either explicitly or implicitly, not only to convey information to the student, but always at the same time to enable the recipient's ability freely to think through for himself what has been communicated. The teacher's awakening of the student into his ability to understand is therefore also an awakening of the student into his ability to be himself. In this sense, the teacher is saying to the student, quote of Ulrich, "I understand you because I do not stand next to you, but in you. I withstand you, I can stand you, without thereby forcing you to be what you are and what you are coming to be in yourself, and without crushing you or pressuring you. To the contrary, this knowing, this standing in your place is precisely what enables you to be yourself, what allows your own objectivity, which is affirmed in you through my presence, to shine forth, what allows you to realize yourself and to show forth your truth from yourself." Unquote. Now, if Thomas said that the teacher remains external to the student, then even this aspect is not something Ulrich simply leaps over in his insight into a certain substitutionary immanence of the teacher in the student. Instead, the difference of the other precisely as other is radically preserved, precisely in this form of interiority that occurs in free attentiveness. For this act of taking the place of the other and standing with him occurs in such a way that what comes to light is precisely the aspect of otherness in the manifest form of free self-possession. The act of paideia, of pedagogy, gives the student the ability and indeed the obligation to become precisely himself and thus different from the teacher. The teacher remains the other and the student as well. In this respect, the externality articulated by Thomas acquires a transformed and deepened aspect. It presents itself as abiding difference and stands out all the more the goal of pedagogy is kept in view from the perspective of the relationship the student has to the teacher. The best teacher, Ferdinand Ulrich has always said in both personal and academic contexts, the best teacher is the one who becomes superfluous for his students. The superfluity, the flowing over of love, which does not cling to itself and which is communicated by the teacher in the matter he conveys in such a way that the student is affirmed in himself and set free, this reaches its perfection in the teacher's becoming superfluous for his students. This liberation is what bears witness to the fact that the gift of knowledge and the attention of the giver that it offers along with it is given freely. To be sure, one cannot give in such a way without running the risk that this gratuity will end in failure and come up sterile, because the genuine giver does not surreptitiously hold onto his gift in a manipulative way, but hands it over unreservedly. Second part, Ulrich as a teacher of philosophy. This is the sense in which Ferdinand Ulrich was and is himself a teacher. Those who have had the privilege of tasting the joy of his school have had the experience that the one who speaks is a genuine giver, one who was himself permitted to receive a great deal and who passed on what he received without any reservation. In doing so, he has never been one to teach for his own ends or with the aim of watching his insights bear visible fruits in the students or in those who received from him. This giving away, of course, nevertheless, does not occur as a careless squandering, but rather always under the genuine perception of the concrete reality of the other. Ulrich does not speak uniformly with every interlocutor. Instead, he speaks in such a way that in each case the person being addressed feels that he is being perceived and affirmed in his depth. Ulrich's friend and companion for decades, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, captures this point precisely. He observes in the first place, quote, that Ulrich's writing style is uncommonly heavy. But at the same time, he reports that his speech is nevertheless light, as his enthusiastic listeners in Regensburg and in the Berchmans Institute in Munich unanimously say, and as I too can attest from decades of experience. He speaks, in other words, about a given subject in a slow and simple fashion until even the dullest of students has grasped his point. He also speaks with an absolutely precise sense of who his listener or listeners are, unquote. The heaviness of Ulrich's writing that Balthasar remarks on is no doubt one of the reasons why the reception of his philosophy has remained up to this point rather spare in spite of the originality and depth of his thinking. Probably even more significant in this respect is that Ulrich never simply carries out his thinking along already established path of inquiry. His first significant publication from 1961, which was also his Habilitationsschrift from 1958, is called Homo Abyssus. When I say 1958, it's an interesting detail because last year, when he realized that this book will appear now in 2018, he realized it's exactly 60 years after his first writing of this paper that it was translated in another language, and he was really excited to realize that. So this book is called Homo Abyssus, das Wagnis der Seinsfrage, that we celebrate this weekend. In this book, Ulrich unfolds truly in abyssal depth the essence of man from the perspective of participation in being. In his vision and experience of being as gift, he stands in constant internal conversation with Thomas, as much as with Hegel and Heidegger, to name just the most important of his dialogue partners. All of his later writings unfold from out of this essay and remain in a constant relation with this foundational thematic, being as gift and man as the personal representative of the giving of being. Ulrich's tendency to follow paths other than the customary ones in academic discourse is also evident, for example, in the fact that by virtue of a profound insight into reality, the relationship between philosophy and theology is transformed in his work into a new, harmonious circumincession without allowing either of the disciplines to dissolve or to be absorbed into the other. A sense of the dialogue between philosophy and theology, the way in which each is reciprocally dependent on the other, is something that has been too little explored in current academic practice in the humanities, though this represents an urgent need. Hans Urs von Balthasar, who judged Ulrich to be, quote, one of the most powerful, if not simply the most powerful philosophical mind in Germany today, unquote, in any event, he saw in Homo Abyssus an effort that overcomes, is a quote as well, Balthasar saw in Homo Abyssus an effort that, quote, overcomes the baneful dualism between philosophy and theology more successfully than perhaps any other previous attempt, unquote. One of the difficulties in gaining access to his written work lies already in its primary intuition from which everything else is unfolded. Being is gratuitous love. One has to find one's way into this primary intuition. One has to learn to imitate and carry out this intuition from within in order to be able to recognize what Ulrich has unfolded from it, for the whole is co-present and co-thematized even in the apparently trivial thoughts on the margin. But just this comprehensive vision of reality, which precisely as philosophy is nourished by the trust that reality is most originally gift, this is the very thing that makes it again so promising to take on the burden of the effort required to read the text. Whoever has once found his way into it and has been able to follow the course of its thinking, to him it becomes evident that Ulrich is a genuine teacher even here, one who has also in the written word very scrupulously and very faithfully serves nothing but the matter itself that he brings to light, and thus he himself always disappears behind it. Third aspect, Ulrich as a teacher in the church. The introduction of the student into a comprehensive experience of reality as a gift is something that Ulrich demonstrates also as a teacher in the church. If being is principally gift or love, then the gift of being is intended by the giver for a recipient, one who stands receptively and affirmingly over against the giver as his other. Ulrich's metaphysics is therefore always already personal and dialogical in its basic concern and fundamental unfolding. The event of the cross, the absolute self-gift of the God-man to the world in need of redemption, makes clear for Ulrich that even the original communication of created being to creation is originally pure absolute gift without ulterior motive or ulterior end. It is gratuitous love. In the Redeemer's self-gift, man, and through man the whole of creation, discovers that being, that life, that reality in its origins is pure gift, which the Creator freely gives and has always freely given, umsonst, one of his favorite words, umsonst, gratis, but also umsonst, gratis und frustra, in vain. Yeah. Therefore, and most originally, a rejection of the proper reception of his gift. The original purpose of creation comes to light anew in the Redeemer's self-surrender which enables man once again to receive being as gift, and beyond this to receive God himself, creator and redeemer, as gift. At Christmas, the church praises God for having, quote, so wonderfully created and yet more wonderfully restored the dignity of human nature, unquote. This insight of faith also unlocks for us the original figure of the church, namely the Mother of the Lord, as the one who in an unreserved and unconditional yes has always already received this divine gift in gratitude and passed it on to others. She gives God to the world. She is therefore the original, personal, sacred space of the church, her encompassing subject, in whom the individual believer is enabled to offer his own free yes and learn anew to receive himself and his creator and redeemer. According to Ulrich, in Mary, the church is therefore the wholly created we structure or we form of freedom. He philosophizes in her, and it is therefore in her and from out of this indwelling that he is not only a teacher of philosophy, a teacher of being as gift, but for that very reason a teacher in the church, in whom he communicates his teaching and indeed himself as a gift. One of the volumes of Ulrich's collected works bears the title Logotokos, on man and the world. On man and the word. Through grace, the man who draws his life from the source of holiness becomes himself a bearer of the word. He is able in word and love, in and with the holy we form of freedom, but also in the midst of and in spite of all the brokenness of his finite condition, nevertheless to bring God himself to the world. Fourth point, Ulrich as a teacher of prayer. With respect to his interpretation of world and church, it follows with perfect inner logic that Ferdinand Ulrich's profound vision of things makes him for many also a teacher of prayer. In the first place, those for whom he has been a personal companion along the spiritual path bear witness to this. A written testament can be found in his precious little book entitled Prayer as the Fundamental Act of the Creature, which, over the course of about 100 dense pages, unfolds finite personhood as Dasein, existence that receives itself in gratitude. Man's proper self-enactment, which he experiences as I am given to myself, is his affirming self-reception from the hands of the giver, which is why even this self-enactment in its most fundamental depth is receptive thanksgiving and at the same time the most profound affirmation of the Creator. In other words, it is prayer. But the creature who also exists as broken simply does not know how he is supposed to pray, as we read in Romans 8:26. That is why he prays in the church, in the liberated we form of freedom that subsists in the mode of thanksgiving, Eucharistia, which is the church's essential act. Concerning this little book, Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote that this is a little summa of prayer. One might ask oneself, he muses, quote, whether Ferdinand Ulrich in this short and dense treatise has not undertaken something that has been awaited for centuries, and whether his achievement is not so profound, carried out with such a critically sensitive ear that is open both to deformations and to genuine enactment of fundamental prayer, that there would be almost nothing left to add to his reflections, unquote. Last point, Ulrich's spiritual fatherhood. Ulrich's last large book is called Gabe und Vergebung, Gift and Forgiveness. As the subtitle clarifies, it's a contribution to biblical ontology. Over the course of 800 pages, he unfolds in this book an interpretation of the biblical parable of the merciful father and his two sons. And also, the entire text focuses on nothing but this single story. Ulrich shows how much the whole comes to expression in the part Das Ganze im Fragment, as Balthasar said. The drama of salvation that is played out between God and man is interpreted here from within the context of a philosophical ontodramatics, which has been elicited and illuminated by grace, in which the mystery of being is unveiled as loved. This interpretation circles over and over again in a particular way around the figure of the Father, who, out of love, gives his two sons freedom, who has always already affirmed them, and in patient hope waits for them to prove themselves truly to be son of the Father, to be children of a liberating love freely given, as human beings who dwell in thanksgiving and in freedom with the Father and celebrate with him the feast of life. The one who is recounting the story in the Bible is in fact the only begotten Son, the eternal Son of the Father, who has always already stood in holy and free obedience to the Father. He desires to draw all men to himself, so that he might live in them and they in him, and so that he can thus lead them into the proper relationship to the Father. As far as it is possible to judge from the outside, it seems just to say that in all of his efforts as a teacher of philosophy and as a teacher in the church, Ferdinand Ulrich has always aimed at one thing and one thing only, that the one eternal Son of the Father might become present in the hearts of all of those who have been entrusted to him, to Ulrich, along his path. In this, the goal of his existence as a teacher, which undergirds and comprehends everything else, never stands in contradiction to the concrete service of individual human beings and the particular path their life follows. Instead, Ulrich once again shows the truth of Augustine's original understanding. Whoever truly finds Christ finds in the deepest sense the truth of his own life. For him, the experience of the incarnate God's redeeming love can never stand in contradiction to the ever particular meaning and purpose of his own life, nor can it be foreign to it. Instead, Christ himself reveals himself to that person as the meaning, as the logos par excellence, as the all-encompassing judge of truth, who both opens up even deeper dimensions of every inner worldly experience of truth and renews it in a transformative way. And it is precisely thus that Christ shows himself to be the true teacher in the most proper sense, behind whom every genuine human teacher ultimately disappears. Ferdinand Ulrich would himself certainly resist being called a teacher. He never founded kind of school, like, for example, Joseph Ratzinger did. But those whom he has accompanied as teacher and guide recognize him as a servant brother who walks with them along the little way, like Thérèse of Lisieux, which is our common pilgrimage. Precisely in the faithful and patient service he undertakes for others, however, he has become for many grateful students and companions a witness of the gospel, a witness that is so formative that it radiates the mystery of genuine spiritual fatherhood. I myself can give testimony that I wouldn't be a religious person, a Salesian, a priest, and not stand here in front of you without his accompaniment. And that's why I'm so grateful to have you all here and to listen to that. Thank you for your patience.